From Vandenberg Air Force Base in Central California, you're watching live launch coverage of NASA's interior exploration using seismic investigations, geodesy, and heat transport, or InSight spacecraft, to study the interior of Mars. Hi, I'm Stephanie Martin, and thanks for joining us. NASA's InSight mission is the 20th mission journey to Mars and will begin its landing phase. InSight enters the Martian atmosphere traveling at 13,200 miles per hour and deploys its parachute and ultimately slows down to about 5 miles per hour for touchdown. 1 minute later, InSight will begin its surface operations, checking out the lander's health indicators and then deploying its solar arrays. It will take about 10 weeks to place all the instruments on the ground. About 7 weeks later, it will sink its self-hammering heat probe about 10 to 16 feet into the Martian soil. There are also 2 briefcase-sized CubeSats known as Mars Cube 1, or MARCO, hitching a ride on today's mission as a part of a NASA technology demonstration mission. MARCO A and MARCO B will deploy from the second stage of the Atlas V about a minute after InSight separates and will then fly toward Mars.
At 1 hour, 28 minutes, and 40 seconds, Centaur releases NASA's InSight spacecraft on its journey to Mars. Deploying from dispensers mounted on the aft bulkhead carrier on Centaur, the Mars Cube 1, or MARCO CubeSats, will provide real-time communication relay covering the entry, descent, and landing of InSight on Mars. MARCO A separates 1 hour, 29 minutes into flight, followed 48 seconds later by the separation of MARCO B.
7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 0. And liftoff of the Atlas V, launching the first interplanetary mission from the West Coast, and NASA's InSight, the first outer space robotic explorer to study the interior of Mars.
Pressures and RPMs. Expect the dam at this point.
It is flying 3 new innovative technologies. NASA Edge's Franklin Fitzgerald spoke with MARCO systems engineer Annie Marinin about these technologies that will be demonstrated.
So Annie, there are 3 new technologies that are going to be demonstrated on MARCO. Tell me what they are.
So the 3 technologies that MARCO will be demonstrating are a propellant system that uses a fire extinguisher fluid to navigate MARCO around. There is a radio that is about the size of a softball that was designed at JPL to interface with the Deep Space Network. And there is an antenna, it's a deployable antenna that's completely flat and it can fold up, but when it operates, it actually simulates a dish that gets a lot higher gain and allows us to send more data back to Earth.
Now, tell me a little bit about this propulsion system, because you know I'm thinking about the engines on a rocket when it takes off. That's not what's happening with MARCO.
No, so the fluid inside the propellant tank is essentially what you would find in a fire extinguisher. So if you've seen the movie WALL-E, there's this scene where WALL-E flies around space using a fire extinguisher and it propels him all the way around.
Right.
That is essentially what MARCO is doing. The thrusters are much tinier, but we actually nicknamed the spacecraft WALL-E and EVA because of that. So we have 8 total thrusters on the spacecraft, and we're using them for 2 things. One is to do what we call trajectory correction maneuvers, which are basically course corrections. So as MARCO flies, we can control its trajectory fairly precisely. And there are thrusters that allow us to change the orientation of the MARCO satellite while it's in space.
So basically it's going to be kind of kicking out compressed air. Okay. Now tell me about this radio. From what I understand, it's something new. It's built right here at JPL. Tell me a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so the group at JPL designed this antenna specifically to operate with the Deep Space Network, and Marco is going to be the first mission to fly this technology. So we've done a lot of compatibility testing with the Deep Space Network, and so we've shown that it's configured well and it will work. We just now need to fly it.
Okay, and then in third is the dish. This trifold
antenna. Yeah, it's called a passive phased array. And so one of the reasons why it's such a cool technology is when you launch a CubeSat, or any satellite in general, volume is a hot commodity. And so in a CubeSat especially, because the whole satellite has to fit into a box, the more box-like all of your components are, the better. And so this antenna folds into a volume about this high when it folds down, but it opens up. It's fairly large, and it simulates a much larger dish that would otherwise have to be curved and would be much harder to actually stow in that volume. So it could enable a lot of really cool communications technologies in the future.
Tell me about what your role will be with the mission as they fly to Mars.
I will be operating one of the Marco spacecraft, and for this mission, what that means is we'll be sitting on a console computer, sending commands and receiving data from the spacecraft. So before every chance we get to talk to it, we get about one chance per day. We'll have a set list of commands and scripts that we want the satellite to execute. And so we'll upload those via the Deep Space Network, all remotely. And then as it's happening, we'll get that data back and see what the spacecraft is actually doing. And hopefully it'll be doing exactly what we told it to do.